just because of just because of the way it is. I can't see everybody and the PowerPoint at the same time. So if at any point you just want to interrupt me, feel free to just do it as you would do in a normal meeting and just unmute and shout at me. That's absolutely fine. But yeah, hello everybody. Um, I know some of you, but not all of you. So just for those that I don't know, my name is Nadine Patel. I'm a creative consultant and I'm here today in the context of my international experience. So I previously worked in the programming department of Sadler's Wells. I was working on their in-house productions, so the ones that they produced in collaboration with international partners. So it's things like Sutra by Sidi Larbi, Shakawi and Echad Khan, and Cast No Shadows with Isaac Julian and Russell Malafant. I also worked with Emma Gladstone to set up the Jerwood Artist Development Programme, and then separately used to programme some of their audience development activities in the Lillian Baylis. I spent 10 years for my sins at the British Council, where I set up the Lagos Theatre Festival, which at one time was the biggest performing arts festival in West Africa. I also developed the Edinburgh Fringe Emerging Producers and Artists programs for global majority producers and artists, and initiated lots of different Creative Europe programs, which I will mention a bit more today because some of them are quite relevant to what you're doing, I think. And then more recently, as a freelancer, obviously I've been a mentor for some of the Caravan Assembly artists, hence I think the invitation for today. But I've also written up recommendation reports for companies like Project Europa to help them with their international partnership development strategy. I've provided a set of recommendations for the Barbican for their international staff exchange program, which they didn't do. So just don't blame me for all their problems. Was the associate curator for a festival in Brazil, which you probably know because it's one of the delegations that comes often for Caravan. It's the Culture Inglesa Festival in Brazil. And I shaped the international strand of the Western Jerwood Creative Bursaries. And then, yeah, earlier this year, I also supported the UK tour of a Nigerian production. We went to Bradford, Leeds, and London. And I'm also a board member of Transform in Leeds. So lots of different experience internationally. And the reason I say that is just to show you the kind of like I've worked at large scale, but also at small scale with independent artists as well as organizations and through a whole series of things. Um, just for today, I've just sort of split it up really. We're going to look at a bit of funding for international work, networks, residencies. I'm then going to just touch upon the Creative Europe programs because they're to do with programming and curation that you might find interesting. And then it's going to be more of an open call, an open session so that we can really sort of drill down in anything in particular that you might want to have. I'm aware you will have slightly different levels of knowledge and experience internationally. So I hope, I've pitched today's session okay, but obviously for those of you who are more experienced in the room, do feel free to share your experience if there's something that I mention. It's a peer-to-peer learning environment. So yeah, and like I said, do feel free to interrupt. I don't need to just be talking at you the whole time. So yeah, let me know if that all makes sense. Is everyone happy okay with that? Yeah, thumbs up. Right. So straight in there, cracking on. I'm just going to just mention ACE because they have changed their funding policy recently. So just to be absolutely clear, um, they don't have priority countries, but they do have strategic initiatives with particular European and Nordic countries. So you'll find they do a lot of strategic partnerships with Germany and France in particular, and some Nordic countries. Um, the Four Nations International Fund, which supports artists from different UK nations to collaborate internationally, they are hoping to have again next year, but it's not confirmed. But really excitingly, they've removed the 15% limit on activity that used to exist around activity that takes place outside of England. The main thing is you just need to emphasize in any application what the long-term impacts and benefits the project would have on the organisation, on the artists, the wider sectors and audiences in England. But whereas before there was that restriction about the amount of activity you could do when applying to ACE, that has gone, which I think is a really good initiative. And they've also said very clearly that you can apply for funding within a project grant for attending networking events or supporting international presenters. You just need to fold that in to the application. So they've really taken on board, I think, that the UK touring sector is so limited, and they want to support that as much as possible. I'm currently um, uh, mentoring numerous DYCP recipients, supporting them on their sort of international kind of development. So they've all been really successful at getting their money and sort of traveling around. So that's really good. I'm going to share the slides, so don't worry too much about taking notes, and they all have the slides also have links, so you can just click and go. So don't worry. I've just wanted to mention a couple of signposting around some couple of funding sites that you might not have considered or are aware of. Culture Funding Watch is a good international funding portal, so it tells you the kind of European and international funds that exist. I've been working more and more with artists and arts organisations that have social impact or social engagement projects. And as we all know, the Paul Hamlin and others are oversubscribed, and there are some NGOs internationally that can support local initiatives in the UK. The Bill and Melinda Gates are one of them. So it's kind of worth checking out their past funded projects to see if something would suit. Also, things like Mofradat, although they're based in Brussels, support, for example, artists who identify as being Arab wherever they're based. You've also got the Bakri Foundation, which is supporting UK-based venues to support artistic projects with Asian links. I'm currently doing some strategic development work with the European Culture Foundation. This is not an EU initiative, it's a European initiative, and therefore UK organisations can apply. They have something called the Cultural Solidarity Fund, which they just last week announced the recipients, and this is very much about social impact, civic engagement, but they also have other programs that they do. And the British Council, as you know, has had various open calls. The current one is for the UK Brazil Season of Culture. But the theatre and dance department has begun to be active again. So feel free to start rebuilding your relationship with them if you can. And they also do quite a lot of go see opportunities. So they just did one with China and East Asia, and that usually happens on a yearly basis. It's about £2,000 to be able to go over and meet and doing connecting grant schemes with potential partners overseas. So they're particularly good still for partnership development outside of Europe. The money that the British Council get is primarily overseas development aid, so it won't be Europe focused on the whole unless they're doing a season. So yeah, going out off the beaten track, they're still quite a good organisation to approach and do go sees. I've just put down here the kind of the usual organisations that are still really active in supporting collaborations and residencies and presentations. They're always going to be the richer countries. But, you do have organizations like The Place that has a yearly festival with the Korean season. In the past, when I worked at Sadler's Wells, had a yearly activity with the Japan Foundation, which was really great. The Nordics Culture Fund is relatively new and is really good at supporting larger scale promotions. You've also got some of those organisations that do co-collaborations and support that. And Pro Helvetia in particular is super active in terms of residencies and exchanges. So if a way of doing that audience development is slowly, let's start bringing things and taking less risk, you can do things with those foundations, which can be really, I mean, Japan Foundation, for example, we used to put on some really out there wacky programs that we would never be able to take the financial risk if we weren't working with them, and just start building that audience. And they're still quite open for it. I also used to, I've done an example was I did a big program of work with the culture attaché at the French embassy, which involved new writing. So we then coordinated that with Payne's Plough, Soho Theatre. They've got it's La Société des auteurs et de compositeurs dramatiques, which is like the PRS for playwriters, which has a lot of funding. So it was just about supporting readings and audience development and exchanges and so on and so forth. And they're always super keen to do that kind of work as well. But that's never advertised. That is something you just need to start inviting them and building that relationship with them. But they're still active, though I would say, obviously, the Germans have just had a massive funding cut. So have the Dutch. So, what happens in Europe politically obviously has an impact on all these organisations, as we saw, with the British Council. Um, for further research, it's worth grabbing a cup of tea and setting time to kind of go into these links that I've got. But I am going to just click on a couple of these because I think it's worthwhile. I'm going to see if this works. So a while ago, I was commissioned to write this practical guide for arts admin to touring post-Brexit. It's for small organisations who want to go to Europe for 3 months. And it's a step-by-step. It's the sort of guide I wish I'd had when I was a producer, to be honest. But it's got case studies and it really goes through all the changes in the legislation. And I can't remember how many countries we did in the end, but there you go, about 17. But if I click on France, for example, to country focus. On all of the country guides, I've just put a couple of links to really useful organisations that you can then do some further research on in terms of potential organisations in country that can help with exchange and mobility and programming, funding their end as well. So, for example, here you've got Mobiculture, which is like our arts info point, but their end. They've also got ONDA, which is the organisation which promotes both ways French artistic programming in a country and vice versa. And they're a really good organisation to get to know. They invite programmers from across France and can facilitate a go-see visit. They haven't done much in the UK since 2012 when I last worked with them, so they might be worth approaching. And various other bodies as well here, including the one that I mentioned, the SDCD. And then the guys are really like, okay, how do I get there? What is the social security do? What do I do? How do I get paid? Tax? It's a real step by step. And then I also have written a link to funding guides. So there's funding guides on there that will tell you all the organisations in country that will pay and will support mobility. So here there's a cultural mobility funding guide for France. And And then you can have a look at the kind of organizations that support it. And so obviously this is France, but I've done as much as possible for all the other 17 countries that I've listed. And I also at the bottom um, did what do you do if you have somebody French coming over, and what are the implications of that? So that's quite a useful um, little document, not only for yourself, but maybe some of the artists that you work with. Um, Let me just try and click out of there so I can go back. Where am I going? Escape. How do I stop going in that? Sorry, I'm going to go back and come back in. There we go. And if you don't want to read, um, I did a workshop for extracts where I talk about cabotage and all the rest of it, which they've posted online. So feel free to watch that. But that's a real kind of nuts and bolts of moving. I'm also going to mention on the move, it has all the international guides globally. So you can find out all about funding initiatives that exist in Latin America, Africa, China, and beyond. That's particularly useful as well if you are working, for example, there's an organization in Africa whose work you really like. They might have access to funding locally that you can't from the UK. So it's worth signposting them to those funding initiatives so that they can see what's there. But it just, even if some of them are slightly out of date, the players tend to be the same. So it's just worth looking at to see and familiarize yourself with the funding initiatives that exist. And On the Move as well has a whole set of resources and publications that are really worth reading as well. I know Caravan has got some really great country briefing websites, webinars as well. I just wanted to mention a couple that I did with Jerwood, which were on their YouTube channel, but now that they've kind of merged, I can only find the Ireland one. So I've got to go back and ask them where the other ones are. But I did an Ireland country briefing with Project Arts in Dublin, Outburst in Belfast, a local broadcaster, and the British Council. And it's a really good kind of overview of the political and cultural landscape of Ireland. And we've done the same in Spain, Romania, Poland, and Italy. So they're quite interesting, particularly in Poland and Italy and Romania, which isn't always as accessible.
Nadine,
Yeah,
I have a question. Do
sure.
you know if there is one that is for the UK that we can send to artists that are coming over here?
No.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, Arts Info Point does have a lot of information about coming in, but I'm not aware of a webinar. So that would be something worth speaking to them about. Um, but I'm not, I mean, the British Council used to do stuff, but I'm not sure that there's anything that's been done recently that I can remember.
Or even just
Uh,
like a document.
So there are documents which kind of list interesting festivals and things like that, but I don't know of like this is the landscape. This is
Okay, cool.
how things
That'd
are.
be
I don't think anyone's
interesting to know.
been doing that. Um, yeah, I think the Arts Info Point, I think, is kind of like to replace visiting arts that used to be there, but they're quite good. I join their coffee mornings once in a while, and I have found them really useful. I think you have to use them or lose them, so it'd be a shame to lose them. And then with the British Council as well, there are certain bigger countries which they've done a lot of research on. So the China one, for example, they've got some great insight which you can access online. And then I also got involved in this other one, which was an Africa festival mapping guide with the Royal African Society, which I will just click through again as well. So give me a minute on that one. And this isn't just me promoting every bloody guide that I do seem to have been involved in quite a lot. But what this one is really interesting and why I really like this one is that we did a YouGov poll. And it was
Nadine, are
about,
you trying to share your screen of what you've clicked on?
yeah, is that
Because
not
it's just showing the slideshow. So I think you have to
okay?
go on to share and then click a different
Okay,
screen.
let's try this one again. Sorry.
Don't worry.
Was that doing it with the guide?
No, sorry, I should have said something. We're
Uh,
being very polite.
you, that was fantastically boring for you.
You explained it all
Okay.
perfectly though.
Right, well then you'll see. Okay, so this is the Royal African Society, but what this one is really good, I think, particularly for programmers, is we did a YouGov poll. And in a nutshell, a lot of the things that people say is like, well, I can't program African work because I haven't got a diaspora nearby or da 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 da. And this was really a kind of poll that sort of demonstrated that white audiences are quite happy to watch work from Africa. They just don't often get the chance, and it's about context and presentation and audience development and so on and so forth. So it was just a really interesting piece of work in terms of trying to slightly dispel the myths and the worries and the concerns that often we hear about audiences locally and why certain work can't be programmed. So anyway, there's some good polling and interesting conclusions and all sorts that you can dive into, which I'm sure are still really relevant now. And then also what we did is put together, we sort of interviewed loads of really fascinating contemporary artists, but also, there we go, we did a sort of mapping of some of the really key festivals both in Africa. Sorry, I'm sort of scrolling like crazy. I can't seem to scroll this down properly. But anyway, we did a mapping of festivals both in Africa and in the UK that present African work and do interesting work, just so that you could start getting a sense of where you might want to go if you were interested in those particular regions and how you might build that up. So obviously some of them, like in Sudan, are probably not happening right now. But the other ones tend to be quite active still. So there was an organization called Arterial Networks that was really a great portal for Africa, but that's become quite inactive in the last few years. So this kind of was there to sort of help replace that and to start building that. So if Africa is of interest, it's a good document to sort of dive into. I'll go back to the PowerPoint. Apologies, looking back and forth. There we go. But yeah, lots of things to kind of have a look at. Right. And then just in terms of the funding guides and the national funders that I mentioned, when applying for those funding pots, you have to kind of write quite differently to um, Arts Council. So there's just a different language that you're going to have to use, which I'll just mention quickly and then flick back to this one, which is often they're much more interested in how the work supports sustainable development goals. So it's about familiarizing yourself with the SDGs, understanding the cultural relation focuses and the mission statements. I do this international funding workshop for these sort of funding pots. And luckily, the Prince Claus Fund has just done a massive program of work around funding demystified, and they have a PowerPoint and a downloadable guide, which kind of almost like for like repeats what I do in my workshop, which is really useful because it kind of backs up some of the things that I'm saying. But it kind of it's a really good guide to download if you ever do apply an application. And I would say it's the same for the British Council. It kind of just clarifies how you might want to frame it. So I know with ACE there are loads of you know, Uncultured and others have done these great templates and guides online, but there are less that help you with the international cultural scene, and these ones are there and are worth looking at. I don't know if anybody in the room has had any success applying for those sort of funds before. No, okay, because there tend to be there's some big pots of money out there, that can be applied for. So it is worth having a little think in the future, maybe if you wanted to do a program, um, about looking at that rather than just relying on ACE. And then just going back, because I know some of you have been to ITM, but here's the list of, the usual networks. But I would also mention that places like the Lagos Fringe have become a bit of a hub. This November, a couple of weeks ago, they hosted a Pan-African festival meetup. So if you were therefore looking to meet artistic directors of other African festivals, they all kind of went to the Lagos Fringe. But Dance Consortium, Fabric, Pace, other UK players all tend to go to the Lagos Fringe as well. So it's kind of a good place to go. And I just wanted to mention as well, Tom Curtis wrote a couple of months ago this great around Europe and 80 festivals, where he really breaks down all the festivals that are currently existing, what they program, what they do, and it's all posted up on the Producer Gathering website, and that's a really brilliant resource as well. If you want to slightly go off the beaten track and not be reliant on ISPA, ITM, and the others, which are great, but will funnel you in a certain direction, and you'll probably meet the same people at the same event. You just happen to meet one in New York and one in Hong Kong, but it's the same people everywhere. If you want to meet people slightly differently, then going to a festival makes more sense sometimes. There we go. And then just in terms of partnerships and residencies, I'm just going to go through these ones just because they're slightly interesting to me, and do really exciting work. And the reason why is it might be, there's some funding. So, for example, the Centre for Less Good Ideas, which I just love the name of, is William Kenridge, who's a South African visual artist. He set this up in Joburg, and it's kind of an experimental space in Joburg. The UK artist Priya Mysteries there, What the Big Mysteries, was there a couple of weeks ago. And there's an opportunity to kind of do an exchange program with a centre like that. I noticed a lot of you in the documentation that was forwarded on to me about the network have spaces and are willing to offer your space and willing to kind of have those exchanges. So it's kind of finding people who might be doing really exciting stuff in places, and then with them applying to one of the national or international bodies for fundings to support that program. I mean, the Point in Eastleigh used to do that quite a lot before with South Africa. And then these are the sort of organisations that have the infrastructure their end to support visits as well, and are doing really, really exciting work. Places like Cité des Arts Internationaux is a university-based space in Paris that does loads of programs. They offer a residency, a production budget of €30,000 for 2 weeks for you to go. Yeah, so why make work in the UK? Try and apply to them. You get a venue, you'll get the university audience, and you get 30,000 to start building. So there are places like that. What they're really interested in is it's an international university, and so it's like becoming an international hub. So it's worth looking at organisations that can do that and have the infrastructure to do so. The Camargo Foundation in Cassis in the south of France it's an American artist who set it up. And it does really interesting initiatives. For example, they're a hub for Black and African playwrights to go and meet and do residencies, but they have this amazing residency, which I would encourage any of you to go on because it's so rare that we get to go on residencies, and it's about cultural thinking, and it's about taking time and meeting places in an international space, but just having time to sit and reflect and research. And they do an open call for that every year. But they're always interested in looking at different programming strands and opportunities. And then you've got other places like Folo, which is in Mali, which is a dance space, but it also has a very strong sustainability practice and is really interested in climate as well as being a dance space. You've got Nafasi Art Space, which is in Tanzania and Dar es Salaam, which is a real international dance hub as well. It's a great setup. It's multidisciplinary as well. So it primarily does dance, but it also does film and visual art. You've got the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. They've got this great thing called Roma MoMA, which is an online uh, uh, Roma contemporary art space. It does a lot of work around queer art in Roma culture, and they recently had the Roma Pavilion in Venice, but they're also a really great organization, and they exist online because obviously uh, Roma communities exist across Europe. So it's not centered in a particular country. You've got the Jam Factory Art Centre, which is Ukrainian, which is still incredibly active, even though they're physically less so. You've got Res Arts, which is the sort of portal to all the art residencies, but it's worth having a little look at some of them. I only engage with fully funded or part funded residencies. I never engage with ones that you have to apply to, but there are some really great organizations there that might tick some of your boxes that are worth looking at. And recently, Arts Admin published the Another Route evaluation. So, Another Route, which is the artist-led residency initiative that Arts Admin and a few others, and another one that I worked on did. And it's got some really nice reflections from the artists who were involved on that kind of building longer relationships and taking time to build those relationships and what that means. So that's just a handful. If post this workshop or during this workshop later during the call, were like, look, I'm really interested in Dallas or Berlin or wherever, I can signpost more accurately. But I just thought those are slightly off the beaten track, not always talked about organizations that might be of interest to you and what you're doing, that wouldn't be going to ISPA or wouldn't be going to ITN, but are doing really exciting work. And then, yeah, so this was to do with the Creative Europe programs that I did. So I did two Creative Europe programs where it, to be honest, they kind of happened because I was at ITM talking to people and we were talking about programming and aesthetics and the challenges of programming across Europe and the kind of dominance of an aesthetic that was very Belgium or very French. And what does that mean? And so we put together a Creative Europe bid, invited 40 programmers, and did sort of two kind of go-see visits with them. One of them was led by Emina Visnik, who is just incredible. And it was looking at the challenges of contemporary work and new audiences and looking at very different approaches to building new audiences. So we had a visit in Portugal and one at the Battersea Arts Centre in the UK, but to be honest, this was about 10 years ago. So it was a slightly different setup then. And then we had another one which was looking at performing arts in public spaces. And we looked at Italy, Poland, and Belgium as examples. And it was like massive go see visits and to really unpick it all. And because one of the things that we felt very strongly was that visual art curators have so many opportunities to talk about their approaches and their curation, and performance programmers rarely do in this kind of international space. So it was really to have that time and to try and have someone with an external eye kind of challenge people's perceptions of programming in various countries and initiatives. And yeah, so we did that one. We did another training program where we did a whole other side, other set of visits. Um, and this is where we kind of really kind of challenged what the aesthetic questions were, what were the audience development questions that you might have, what were the technical questions around improving circulation and what we saw as our identity and role as programmers. And then these are some kind of the provocations that we had, around standardization. If you look at the European festivals, they're often very homogenous in the kind of aesthetic that they present. And what kind of influence does that have on smaller circulations and artists themselves, how they feel they need to present themselves, um, the loss of identity that you get. This is something with Caravan that we get all the time with people thinking they have to present in a certain way to international promoters. And yeah, so it was just a whole series of conversations about how to look at performances and what does that mean, and what are some of the really successful initiatives that people have taken in presenting quite difficult or challenging work. And that sense of ownership that you get from audiences with certain spaces and so on and so forth. So it was just really having a really great unpicking of all of that. And then these were the festivals in which we had those meetings. Um, Although the UK at present is a third country, so can't be in receipt of funding from Creative Europe, I know that there is conversation that during Bradford, ITM might do a bit of a panel discussion around how the UK can still be involved in Creative Europe programs and to be part of that funding. So that's just something to bear in mind. But this is where I would also consider, um, a network such as yourself, applying for some kind of, European funding, which isn't EU funding, like the Cultural Solidarity Fund. If you were looking at censorship or whatever it is, a thematic programming idea, it could support maybe that kind of initiative as well. Because I think it is something that we need to keep talking about, particularly in this funding landscape where it's becoming more and more complicated and difficult programming, which I don't need to tell you because you need know all about that. Sort of, I'm sure you all know about that. But yeah, so with this PowerPoint presentation, like I said, I'll share it. And if there were certain points that you separately wanted to discuss, then feel free to look at it or come back to me at a later date. Of that you can see from the festivals that we went to, the kind of festivals that we went to, that why those conversations might have taken place, and then different set of festivals would trigger a whole different set of conversation. But yeah, I think that's to consider. So I'm just going to stop sharing because I feel like I've just talked at you a lot, and I want this to be a bit more targeted. So let me just, sorry, I'm just going to change my screen so I can see everybody at the same time. Feel free to unmute if you want it to be a bit more of a conversation, but was there anything with what I went through there that kind of jumped out or sparked a thought, or you wanted me to drill into more detail?
I had a question about the Hong Kong showcase and wondered to what extent it is now an arm for propaganda for the Chinese government. And the reason that I ask that is because we've got quite a big migrant population from Hong Kong in Barnet.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm just aware that, yeah, I'm just aware of those nuances.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a combination of both because a lot of the artistic um, leads there are kind of censored, but are still not fully instrumentalized by the government. So a lot of the people you will find there have been there for a long time, have been active for a long time, but you will not be having that political debate in their presence. But they are sensitive and aware and suffering, to be quite honest, as well. There is less of a hands-on approach to that particular platform, I would say, to others, because it's not directly funded through the Chinese government. It's really difficult. I mean, Natalie Chan, who did the kind of program up in Edinburgh a couple of years ago, was in that really knotty, difficult situation of like trying to balance and navigate the programming with artists who are quite are against the government but are still being supported. So what I'm saying is it's not fully instrumentalized any more than I would say Made in Scotland or any others, which is all about showcasing a thing, and that the artists themselves do, but that you are not going to use those spaces to have those conversations because it's just too dangerous for them to be vocal about their discontent. I would not necessarily with your audience, have a fully state-funded
I
Chinese
definitely wouldn't do that.
It wouldn't happen anyway. But yeah, no, so I think it's still interesting because you still do have access to some of the really interesting artists. And there are a couple, well, there's 3 organizations that I know. One that does like hardcore contemporary artist residency in Hong Kong. None of those artists are pro the government, but they're still doing international exchanges and still hosting that space. So they still work in that space. They just have learned to navigate it. And there's still a lot of really exciting disability arts organizations based in Hong Kong doing really interesting work. And you still have the West Kowloon and you still have all of those other places. But yeah, navigating it is more tricky for them. I mean, that's one of the problems with the various markets. So Latin America, for example, and others, is that you kind of have to find the individuals because it's so volatile because of the political landscape. So you can spend years sort of building a relationship with an organization in those spaces and then they just get pulled. But I would say in Europe, all the kind of people that I was working with in Poland got pushed out when the right-wing government came in, and they've come back in again. So kind of those organizations, places like France, where artistic directors it's a political appointment, are always more complicated than whereas in the UK. Well, there was an attempt, I think, a little bit. This isn't being put on YouTube, but we all know when we all had sudden chairs and boards were being slightly tampered with. But obviously it's slightly different. But a lot of European countries, that's what the case is. It's a political appointment to have those ADs in place. So yeah. I mean, Matt, what have you done recently? Because you've done loads of stuff. And I can't believe you haven't applied for loads of funding internationally.
Yeah, I've been puzzling that really. I think it's a capacity and time thing at the moment, and where we put our energies, particularly when those of us who are NPOs have a shed load of paperwork just to manage that relationship, steward those funds. And yeah, a lot of the targets for our fundraising team are, the money necessary to support our creative learning programs and things like that, rather than support for artistic programming. I mean, it's interesting when you sort of mentioned in passing, the pan-European focus on sort of Belgian French aesthetic, and so that's 100% my focus. Developing the Belgian relationships at the moment is where particularly Flemish relationships. So actually, I was in Bruges and Ostend at the weekend for a really fascinating Flanders Arts Institute research project called Probability of Exchange,
Yeah.
which included some other partners from the UK. So Tracy Gentles, who's the new artistic director of Sick Festival in Manchester, and who else was there? Dan Kopp was supposed to be there at the weekend from Bradford 2025. Trina Garrett from, damn it, I've forgotten the name of Trina's company, Foreign Affairs, which is a smaller theatre company in London, and Nick Anderson from Shoeback
Yeah.
Festival. We sort of split the UK contingent between the two bits of the project because classically with all of these things, European, they had far more UK applicants than applicants from other parts of the world. But were also joined by Kaya from Kanuti Gildasal in Estonia, and Gabrielle Martin from Push Festival in Vancouver, and Kelly from Sabakwa in just outside Johannesburg. So it was a really interesting international conversation about exploring regenerative practice and radical democratization in culture. And it's a bit of a pilot, really, to see how that progresses. But I think it has a fascinating opportunity, I think, to look at how we work both nationally, locally with artists, and internationally to develop really long-term conversations that aren't transactional in the way that most of our or a lot of our conversations can be with artists. You know, there's the sort of buyer-seller dynamic, the power dynamic in that, rather than having the time and space to sort of think more longitudinally and to sort of learn about one another's practice in different ways. And I think that's, you know, I've come back thinking I want to blow a hole in the program in 2026 to allow space to do that, rather than, you know, the challenge that we have at the moment with, you know, all the artists that we're working with in the UK having to have 12, 18-month lead times in order to have 3 or 4 attempts at securing project grant funding, because, you know, success rates are down to 5%.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's how do we solve those? Yeah, it's the combination, I think, of how we solve those problems locally, nationally, and internationally. And I think this conversation is particularly interesting in like the resources and the information that we can pull on is both for how we bring work in and how we support the artists that we're working with to sort of work internationally. And I think we often see those things as two very separate issues, but actually I think for me they're very much one and the same.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, so one thing, you know, as somebody who does Arts Council applications as well, there's nothing worse than Arts. I mean, like, it's the worst. It's the worst. And any other application that you will do to an international funding body will not be as painful, as long time consuming, or, you know, starters. There is that. And absolutely, you know, like the Nigerian play that I supported, it took 10 years to get it here. And in a way, did I get it here? I got a sold out house, but I mean, you know, like, I sold out, but I didn't get a venue. Like, I'd managed to get a venue, but that was given to me for free, but it wasn't in partnership with a venue. I mean, they came to it and they were like, "Oh my God, it's amazing!" And it was like, "I know, but too late," you know. But it did take 10 years to try and achieve that, because it was so difficult to do. And yes, I would say also that artist to artist piece is, you know, like, so much of the invitations into countries are from artists to an artist, and it's how do we facilitate that way in and that exchange as well. And that's really that's really difficult as well. I completely get that.
Yeah, so just say I was also sort of reflecting on what you shared, and you know, you can see in your practice that you've really focused on some particular. Well, you've had a global focus, but you have had specific focus as well on, you know, sub-Saharan Africa and France and sort of those parts of Europe as well. And I think that sort of suggests to me that the importance of having that focus actually, or to have a real a strategy or a tactic around developing our relationships with specific markets or specific countries or regions, because we can really deepen our engagement in that way. If we have a very broad spectrum approach, then we can never travel as far with those relationships as you can, or with that expertise as you can, if you do have that sort of deeper focus. And like you say, the difference between how a visual artistic curator might approach this issue, and how we look at these things as, largely performing arts organizations, programmers, curators, is really interesting, because, like, as we all know, a curator will put together a show of X number of pieces, 12 pieces. That show will run for 6 weeks, 3 months, and they can really get into the detail, really get into the practice of those artists that they're working with, the thematic of that work, the politics of that work, in a way which is much harder for us to do when we're programming with the kind of volume and turnover that we're often programming. And our connection with that work is necessarily, because we're only human and we have limited brains and space in our lives, is much lighter touch on those pieces than or those relationships with artists than it can be, for those of our colleagues in the visual arts, which is also something like slower working for me might allow us to have that depth of relationship with artists that I think could support the ecology in a very different way.
And then I think that's where doing the residency programs, or the kind of behind the scenes things, or like I said, with the French Embassy, but I know, with Dance Umbrella and others, there was like programs of work which were, with Dance Umbrella, it was about 15 grand set aside, and it was all behind the scenes, but it was about enriching and feeding in, and you can see how that's shaped the program for Freddie moving on. But it all started with these kind of behind the scene hub moments that would take place, of invitations to artists to spend time and be with him and others. And that might be a more achievable with your capacity kind of initiative. But then, you are limited to who's got the money. But if you happen to want the Flemish, then you're on the right track, because they've got it. They've got the money. Which is
I mean, I think that is the thing. The Flanders House in London, the Flemish generally are a bit of an open door, and they've had specific funds post Brexit to sort of re-establish and sort of compensate for the impact that political breakdown has had on their cultural sector. I'm also hoping pretty much there. Like, we'll be co-commissioning a new piece by Berlin, working with Sophie van. I can't remember. I'll do her full name yet. Got to practice that one.
Yeah.
But a young emerging artist, which will be exploring whether it's possible to have relationships across a political divide. So the piece is called Swiping Right. It's based on the idea that Sophie spent 2 years as part of her research at CASC, which is the art school in Ghent, only dating men from Belgium and Netherlands who expressed far right opinions, and having conversations with other couples who have very divergent political views. So, like, really exploring these issues of polarization that we have in society, but through a very very sort of personal, intimate experience. So she'll be coming over to us at the end of February, I hope, where she may be dating people from the far right in Cambridge, or maybe Peterborough. I was thinking we haven't got too much far right in Cambridge, but Peterborough does. So I think, and for me, that again is an example of the sort of the development of a relationship that I've had with David Bowens, who was manager of Entre Hoods, and is now artistic lead for Berlin. So like, how do we track those relationships ourselves with artists, with directors,
Yeah,
to sort of
yeah.
for us to embed that practice in the life of the building.
I think for the work that you do, I mean, if you're not aware of it, the Cultural
Mm,
Solidarity Fund, I think, is right up your
mm,
street.
mm.
So would be worth having a little look at.
And
Um,
the other thing I've only just become aware of in the last 24 hours, actually, I had a really interesting chat last night with an academic, but also he currently works for Trivandi, which is the company who managed all the events, delivered all the events as part of London 2012. They're a sort of major event delivery, multinational event delivery organization. But he was talking about Horizon funding,
yeah,
European research funding, and he was talking about Pillar 2 and Pillar 3 being areas of that fund being areas that could really look at securing research funding that could support something. We're looking at the development of an international program for Cambridge, like an international festival program for Cambridge. And he was suggesting that something like the innovation funding under Horizon could be a way to support some of that work. Particularly
yeah,
around how do you develop evaluation structures, and how do you embed research in those projects from the start. And I think that's also a bit of a focus for us. Actually, is how do we make those connections with HEI
yeah.
to support that work, particularly where you can sort of make connections between artists and academics. But
Yeah,
he was touting big figures. He said he's raised something like 6 million over the last 4 years from research funds to support that sort of work.
Yeah, so yeah, it just made me think as well as so that was one of the things with Project Europa, for example, that as part of what I was recommending it. So with them, it was slightly different because the kind of signposting and research that I did was really much more in line with their kind of practice, um, and the kind of foundations that support their initiatives. But it was also about the number of opportunities there are to present work in an academic setting that exist as well, and how to get into those research networks and how to link into those as well. And to because they're often looking, and will pay for artists to come and present and talk on certain topics. And then it just sort of unlocks other kinds of bits of funding as well that you might not consider. And actually, I talk about Horizons in it as well. So I'm happy to share some of those links as well. There's a couple of like just really easy networks that you can just link up to, and then it will just, they just do calls all the time as well. But yeah, yeah. So the European Cultural Foundation are also the ones that set up Erasmus. So they're very much part of that kind of thinking and network. They're the ones that initiated it originally.
And I also they heard about Erasmus Plus at the weekend as well, which I think has a does it have a cultural focus? I was trying to remember in what
Mm.
context somebody was talking about it.
I mean, it's Erasmus Plus is it's not dedicated to culture, but it can use culture as a kind of vehicle for education and training, if that makes sense. So it's more about a vehicle for that purpose.
Nadine,
Yeah.
just for some of the people who aren't at the meeting, I was wondering if I could ask you to talk a bit more, because you touched on your research around, I guess, like dispelling myths around developing audiences for international work, and some people are on at the early stages of international strategies, and was wondering, one, firstly, let's absolutely go away and read that research that you've already done, but maybe some like, I guess, I know this sounds awful, but like top tips or the main things
Yeah.
you learned from that research would be super helpful.
So I guess there's various markets, and it's really being clear about what your motivation to go internationally is. And if it's about, I need money, there are some ways of like, these are the touring circuits, and just, these are the ones you need to pursue. I think there is a lot about how artists and arts organizations talk about their work and to who. 99.9% of work, if you speak to a British artist, will be, I've done something really political, but it's really funny. Bums on seats, don't worry. You know? And if you talk to a German promoter, they'll be like, why the funny bit? Like, why are you talking about the funny bit? It's a physical movement take on misogyny in underrepresented sittings, but it's really funny. Don't worry. It's funny. It's funny, And if you look at anything, it's always that. Like, I take a funny approach to blah. And it doesn't fly in other countries, right? They're like, this is serious stuff. Like, you can be funny, but why are you putting this up front? I mean, Kim Noble is huge in Belgium. Like, he's not the artist you would expect to be as big as he is, but he's huge and he's funny. But, he's doing serious stuff, and so it's just about also really being sensitive to who you're talking to, the language that you use when you talk to them, and showing that you've done a bit of research before approaching them as well. And having done that kind of desktop research of looking at the festivals, what they're programming, getting a sense of what it is that they're doing. Because that tour booking model only works for some people, and it's kind of also doesn't work in Europe as much as, it just doesn't. So it's about really looking at your website, looking at the work that you do, and really thinking about language and who you want to pursue. But, it's like, if
Sorry,
you
just
want,
to be really clear, are you
yeah,
talking about pursuing artists or pursuing audiences?
uh, pursuing, well, I mean, in that terms, it's kind of like, if you're looking to engage with a promoter and their audience, you need to get a sense of what it is that they're doing and what they're doing and how they present work to their audiences, if you see what I mean. So uh, somewhere like Campo, another one in Belgium, if you just look at how they present some of our British artists and how they frame it and the marketing language that they have, it will be completely different to the marketing language that we use here. So it's just about really thinking, and that goes to, like what Matt was saying about presentation and programming and so on and so forth. So like my top tips are, start looking at language, because that's often the first thing where people shut down, their eyes glaze over, and they switch, like they're just not interested. It's, so it's like, how do you have the conversation? And to have the conversation, it is part of what you guys have been doing about going to ITM, being in those rooms, starting to listen and to find those joining the dots. And in places off the beaten track in particular, it will all be down to people and relationship building. And so it's that conversation. And then also, I would say how you have the conversation varies. So there are certain people who have got a working relationship that exists almost entirely on Instagram DMs.
Mm.
That's how they communicate.
Mm.
So it's also been like, okay, well, with this lot, I'm going to have to be on WhatsApp, and on this lot, I have to be on Blue Sky now. And then with this lot, I mean, no one's on there yet. So, um, but it's also being like, if there are particular people that I want to have an engagement with, I'm going to have to pursue them in different ways, which is why, I can't be global, because I just don't have the capacity to maintain all those relationships. On the other hand, I know somebody who knows somebody, so you can name any country from Iran to, Mongolia, and I will be able to call in one step and get you somebody who knows somebody, So it's kind of like starting to build those networks. But I'm particularly interested, obviously, because as a freelancer, it helps, but to be in those places where it's really hard to do desktop research online, and you do need to kind of have somebody to do an introduction. So me being a conduit is useful for me as well, but also because things are volatile, to have a couple of people who are stable helps maintain that as well, I guess. But I would just say also in terms of the work is um people will be picking work globally from the world. They have the pick from the world. So why they're going to pick you over somebody else is really important. And to be really frank, and I used to have that all the time when I was curating for the British Council Showcase, is that we would have pieces of work that would get 5 stars and everybody was loving it in Edinburgh, and I would not have picked it. And people going, how can you not? And it's like, because it's just not going to sell. It's just not going to, even though it's hugely appealing in a UK context, when you can pick from the world and you're based in, another country, it is competitive. They have got a choice. So what is it that you're really bringing that is unique and different? There's no surprise Dan Dore right now is touring as much as he is touring.
Mm.
And that's not to say other people aren't doing good work, but what he's doing is so unique. There is only Dan Dore.
It's so interesting though, because I was on the audience agency research like open meeting yesterday,
Yeah, for the
and
touring.
Liz Council was saying that like the international side of what they do is there because that if they were to tour in the UK, they just wouldn't be able to support the show.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, completely. So I'm a chair of Action Hero. 80%, I mean, like, they just don't tour in the UK much, like they exceptionally toured recently because they did their first sort of theatre space piece, but 80% of their work has to tour abroad because there's just no audience for it. They're saying that they never do Belgium. They
Mm.
couldn't get a Belgian promoter to pick them for love or money because they're too, it's just not the right aesthetic. So it's also being really aware of that and cultivating that. But they also spend so much time going to festivals, even if they're not programmed, just building that relationship, because what you ultimately want is to get a commission. What you ultimately want is somebody to go, like Mark Yeoman in Quarantine or whoever, like, it doesn't matter what your show is, whichever new show you do, I'm commissioning it.
Mm.
I will put money into it. That's the ultimate goal, isn't it? To just have somebody adore you as an artist, and it doesn't really matter what the show is, they will program it.
I was going to add to that. I mean, I think there are two things here. There are both, how good some of our audience development can be in this country, and at the weekend, hearing what Tracy's doing in North Manchester around really embedded, genuine community audience engagement, which is, not taking the approach of like, here's a big shiny dark European thing, you'll like it, won't you? But actually sort of really discussing what that audience might engage with and, co-creating, co-curating that program with those people. Then there are no sort of comparable examples like that, or very few comparable examples to that in mainland Europe, because they just don't have the challenges of audience development that we have, because sadly they have a much more culturally engaged, culturally educated audience base, and they can put on whatever they like and people will come, generally speaking. So they've never really thought about audience development, and they don't have to translate marketing copy in the way that our marketing teams often do. The story I always tell is, when a marketing team in one of the organisations I work with edited the copy I'd written for the programme because it didn't have a reading age of 8. It had a reading age of 12, and they had to bring down the reading age of the copy that I wrote so it was suitable for a son reader who has a reading age of 8. And so, like, we have a challenge there when we're bringing international work in, when their copy is not suitable for our audience, not appropriate to our audience, or not what our audiences might expect to read, to translate it so that it does connect, or at least so that the marketing intelligence that we do have suggests that it could connect better. And then we have the opposite issue where a UK company might be trying to pitch their work internationally, and they our artists and companies have a tendency towards hyperbole in their work, and that just doesn't fly with a European audience, and some of the aesthetic, like Nadine said around action hero, the aesthetic of the work just doesn't land because it has been grown, it has been developed through real thought about a UK context. The thing that I think I often feel that international programmers, it's not that an international programmer isn't interested in artists from the UK, it's not interested in the work that is made for a UK audience, not interested in what a UK audience might be interested in. And so that is the challenge for us if we're to stay connected to international perspectives and have a sense of international representation in the program. Then we have to work out ways of sort of what's the word? Compromising isn't quite the right word. Bringing together different languages in a sense, sort of making a new language that is at the connection of those two contexts. I think, although various, it's not just a singular international context and a singular UK.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, completely. And there's definitely an advantage, like, I mean, I could sell out this Nigerian play in London because I just had to WhatsApp loads of black theatre networks, and it's like I'm in a completely different position because I can do that because that audience is there. And
yeah.
So yeah.
I was just, I mean, Harriet, this, talking to Gabrielle from Push at the weekend, it's clear that she's got a real interest in quite a lot of, for me, quite a lot of the work that we're supporting anyway. And how do we grow those friendly relationships so that they are to the benefit of those artists that we're supporting longer term. Yeah, like I say, knowing which doors are open to us and then going hard on those.
Monique?
Yeah, I wondered if I could get your thoughts on collaborators in the family work sphere, particularly coming in but also going out.
Yeah, so I mean, you've got the usual that I'll be honest isn't a huge area of expertise of mine. So apart from the usual the networks that exist, which have been around forever, there are certain countries that I know have a kind of a specialism in that. I know that there was meant to have been a showcase to kind of supplement Imaginate recently. They had been looking into it, an international showcase that they were going to do in the UK as well. And I don't know where that's landed. It was Claire who was looking at that with Phil Hargreaves at one point, actually. So I'll do a bit of research into some things like that. But apart from the usual international networks that exist for young audiences, I'm not aware of any that have been built specifically. Yeah, I think the problem is because a lot of the funding is usually for 18 to 35-year-olds, it's always really difficult. There's less opportunities, basically. Sorry, that's not very helpful.
Oh, that's helpful to know.
Yeah, sorry, it's just not very, I mean, it is active, but there isn't as many opportunities.
I'm probably going to ask a really stupid question, which will show my like newness to working internationally. But as someone new to it, I kind of feel like there's a like it's a kind of work that is quite lofty that will get here, that will come over here, and I'm interested in for for bringing international work in that feels like it can put bums on seats
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
cultivating good night out kind of way. Like,
Yeah.
where's the best place to like look for that work? Because I feel like when I see
Yeah.
international programs, I'm a bit like,
Well,
whoa.
often the international programs are in festivals, and the festivals like Lift and others are trying, and Transform will try and push the envelope a little bit in terms of what they're presenting. I mean, that's where, for example, the Nigerian work that I did was the kind of Nigerian work that you don't get to see, that absolutely audiences were, really keen to respond. I mean, it was quite hard-hitting work. It was by no means a simple piece of work, actually. But it's that kind of like, where does that sit within the venues? And there are certain venues that are obviously looking for that work. I mean, that's when you kind of have to not be looking at just festival pieces, and cultivate, I think, those relationships with the spaces that support art making as much as anything, and can be more tapped in. Um, but yeah,
Sorry.
I don't think, I mean, also like when we talk internationally, in terms of lofty and, there is, like I say, a particular dominant aesthetic that is more mobile and is moving, but that is certainly not what people are making.
Mm-mm.
It's
I
just they
think
don't always get presented.
I think that's really, really useful what you say about looking at the spaces where these places are made rather than just the festivals, because I feel like
Yeah,
as like budgets become more constrained, like if we're sending people over on a go see visit, you're going to go to a festival because you can go and see the most work, right? But
absolutely.
actually, in terms of the work that maybe is going to work best in the context of your venue, like how do you set up relationships with those particular
Yeah.
organizations so that you're across what's happening more
And
locally rather than like this
yeah,
international platform, which also puts so much more pressure and expectation on the work that you're going to go and see. So maybe you are expecting a certain kind of aesthetic.
yeah, and it's a definite funnel.
Mm,
And that's where I think the IT caravans can be really interesting. The ones that take you into a country that would be harder to access and get to see that
mm,
work,
mm,
but that wouldn't get programmed outside of it. I've certainly seen some, extraordinary work when I was in Warsaw, which I've never seen outside of Warsaw because it would never get programmed. And you'll get those echoes across Europe. A Serbian artist like, I don't want to do a piece of post-war trauma piece, thank you. But that's
yeah.
all you're going to program in your European festival. I want to do something else. So there's loads of work that is being made locally that doesn't travel. So if you're only going to the international festivals, you're not going to see it,
Mm.
you know.
Yeah, because when we bring work in with house, it's not presented in a festival context, like it
Yeah,
just lands
yeah,
with the venue. And I
yeah.
think we can definitely do some like more work on how and where we're
But I
finding
would say
that.
that's where a partnership, like a strategic partnership, let's say you do it with Pro Helvetia because they've got the money to help support artists, but also, Switzerland is a really interesting international hub. So it has a lot of migration. So it also does have a lot of migrant artists who are now based in Switzerland. So it's not just, um, but they struggle to get programmed, outside. So they're kind of going to be more receptive and would be really willing to support longer term relationship building with those organizations in Zurich and Bern and others that you might not be able to get, but they're not going to be at Kunsten, like, or wherever. So it's kind of like, yeah, it's about getting that sense of like who's doing interesting work. And that's the same. That's where the Lagos Fringe and others come in, is like they're not they're doing work for a very different kind of audience base. Uh, you know, whereas if you're in France where it's free or by subscription, you can take completely different programming risks and have a completely different style of work presented.
I
Um,
think from my perspective, Harriet, one of the thing, it's not that much more expensive. In some cases, it's cheaper to get on the Eurostar and go somewhere or get on a plane. I appreciate environmental sustainability issues, but to get on a plane and go to a European country can be cheaper than me going up to Manchester.
Definitely.
So I think it's just the mindset, and I think the opportunity to go to different venues in whichever countries might be interesting to us would be really, really helpful, because actually those are the relationships that we can then build and take on. I think the festivals are brilliant for getting a broad range of aesthetic, but we not of aesthetic of work in a particular aesthetic, but don't always enable us to see what is relevant to an audience that we might be programming for.
Yeah, and I think that's where, like, using France as an example, that was where if House was to do a partnership with Onda, and then you would do like a 4 day, let's go around France, you know, go to the 104, which is in a really tough part of Paris, which is off the beaten track and is doing some interesting work. And how are they building their audiences in that space, not in the center of town? And that allows you the time to have that relationship and see that work. And, and they can facilitate they can facilitate that and do the equivalent, in Marseille, which is also going to have a completely different to Toulouse and then there might be some replicas. I mean, that was definitely something, with the Western Sherwood bursary that I was trying to support the participants on, was that, as working class creatives, they had this notion that they had to reach a certain level before they could think internationally. And it was like, well, actually, internationally might feed into your practice or your career now and support it. And you, based in Cardiff, might have more in common with someone based in Marseille than you do in London. So, like, how do we help build and look transnationally and thematically? So, how, artists that are interested in feminism working across borders as opposed to British artists going to Germany. That's kind of pretty dead. I mean, on the PowerPoint presentation, actually, I mentioned the Reshape Network, which is another Creative Europe program that I helped to initiate, and they did these prototypes around transnational working, and there's some really lovely initiatives. But there's a directory on that as well of artists who are doing some really interesting work, which is very much about community and audience. And so that might be a network that's more in keeping with what you're doing than TPAM or whatever. The only thing is sometimes there's an advantage. So if you go to Grahamstown in South Africa in July, you're not only seeing African work, but all the international programmers go to Grahamstown. So it saves you doing a trip to Australia or whatever. Like there are certain festivals that do attract an international circuit that, it's really useful to be there because you're talking to them as much as anything else.
Thanks, Nadine. That's really helpful.
But I really appreciate, like, I know all the constraints and the pain. So I'm not, not saying anything if it's easy, but they're like separate, it's like what the steps which are, capable within the capacity and funding structure. But I would definitely say, we know what the UK is looking like right now. And if we don't think internationally, it's really problematic,
But it's really helpful, right? Because this has already got me like thinking about like what other funds that like House can be applying for to help facilitate go see visits that maybe are to venues and not to like festivals and that kind of stuff, and what's available to us and to our network members at the same time.
And also having Caravan attached to Fun and Maltings, like there are so many relationships with so many of the organisations you've just mentioned that exist within Caravan that we can kind of go, oh, actually, this would make loads of sense. Like, let's have that conversation, and the whole thing can be a bit more joined up.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think you were very lucky to get Mark Yeoman over to Caravan this year, because I think that was the first time he's been to the UK in about 20 years. Because he has had zero interest in any work or any programs delivered by anybody in the UK for the whole of that time. And I think in thinking about the aesthetic or the practice that we might want to connect with. I mean, I think this is separate from, what you might program for house, because that, you have decided a particular approach to that, which is what it is. And I think if we want to make those connections seriously with a network of both venues and festivals, it's not just about festivals. Obviously, if we want to make connections with people like Vieux and Campo and Centre Pompidou and some of the big players in this, then we have to really explore how we are developing our programs as well. And I think there's plenty of work in the UK that has that bums on seats quality that you talk about, Harriet. That's why organisations like us program comedy and music and things like that, which have that, so that we can then cross-subsidise work which has a greater sense of contemporary practice, of creative risk, of challenge, of a lot of the things that I certainly look for in that work that we're finding internationally, and also that we know international programmers are looking for in the work that they're programming from the UK. They're not programming the stuff that, like Nadine's saying, might be 5 stars in Edinburgh, and might be the stuff that we see most often in programs in the UK. And so I think working internationally gives us an opportunity to develop our programs rather than resign ourselves to the cultural death spiral that I think a lot of places have accepted as the way to operate.
Just in case that was worrying, Matt, that is not my approach to the international.
But I don't think it's an either or.
No,
I think space. And I think that we potentially make out a rod for our own backs if we see it as an either or, because what appeals to my Romanian audience has a wide breadth of things that they like and they disagree. So I think it's more about who is the audience for the experimental, which is back to our own UK, our own daily questions. Who's the audience for the experimental? Who's the audience for the stuff that they might be slightly outside their comfort zone, but it's still bums on seats, because that's good quality work from an international context.
Yeah, I mean, there is a couple of programmers, like I'm thinking Gregor at Spring and Zephyr, and just there's a couple of people now on the European scene who come from slightly different backgrounds, who haven't been brought up in a Western European kind of environment, and so are challenging a little bit what's happening and thinking about audience development slightly differently and thinking about it more deeply. So they might be actually more interesting to connect with as well, because they would understand that kind of tension that they have. I mean, I remember inviting Lynn Gardner to do a talk to European programmers about why British work is what it is. And it was mind-blowing, it's like, we act from the neck up and we do this and we do that, and it was just like, and this is why it comes, and this is what the history is, and and suddenly everyone goes, oh, okay, because we just don't understand where's the director's vision. It's all about the playwright. It's so boring, and it's just like, well, there's a reason for that. And it's this, and all that sort of stuff. And just having those conversations both ways as well is about that kind of framing and presenting, and then knowing how to better present that to your audience and explain it and bring them in, and what are the steps and all of that stuff. But I mean, of course, if you had all the time in the world to think about it, I'm sure you would all be able to do that. But I think, there is definitely, as part of Caravan and everything, I mean, one of the things with Caravan, I would definitely say there is often an emphasis on the US, and I wouldn't say US is the most lucrative or beneficial country to kind of consider. There's no money. Everybody wants to go to Under the Radar. Why? It's like wanting to go to Avignon. Okay, you get a big star, but then what? Are those really the kind of, what are the British artists making, and what are the international markets? And do we need to do a reconcentration of like how we sort of develop relationships that are useful for them. I mean, with Mark Yeoman and quarantine, I spent 2 years having to like really be like prove my kind of chops to him and then say, look, I really think they're on at Sadler's Wells. Please come and see them. I really think you're going to like them. But it was 2 years of me talking to him and showing him that I knew what I was talking about before he went, all right, I'll bloody go, you know. So, you know, yeah, it's a kind of, it does require a different kind of approach. Anyway, yeah, that's another thing. Lots of more, I mean, if this sparks more conversation, hurrah. But hopefully, you know, in the presentation today, it's a bit of signposting some practicalities that might be useful. But like I said, if there are other networks or other markets or other areas that you're like, actually, that's what I'm really interested in, I'm happy to look and share or signpost that.
Thank you so much, Nadine. It's been really, really helpful just to like have everything pulled into one place, and like so I hope for all of you guys so many little threads that you could pull on or dive into, and loads of reading, which everyone's got time for, right?
Just what you want to do at Christmas, you know, mulled wine, looking at the Brexit guide.
What a treat. Brilliant. And thank you everyone else for making this time in what is like very, very busy days for all of us. So really appreciate it. And hopefully see most of you on Friday in real life.
See you on Friday.
See you later.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, take
Bye.
care.
Bye. See you on
Bye. Thank
Friday.
you. Thank you.
Thanks, Nadine.
Thank you. Bye.